So we're looking here on Lamed Beis, Amid Beis, and we're talking about a machlokes between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara, and the Gemara is going to explain that machlokes. And we had a lot of trouble yesterday with Bar Kapara. So one of my goals for today is to figure out the logic of Bar Kapara. The logic of Rabbi Chia is intuitive. We're talking about a case of a double violation when a zar does avoda in the Mikdash on Shabbos. Let's say, for example, a Kohen is allowed to do and obligated to do the avoda of Tzmidim Musafim on Shabbos. But in the case of a zar, not only is he chayav for a zar sha'ovad, when a zar does the avoda, which is a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, but in addition, there's nothing to override the Shabbos. So he's chayav for chil Shabbos. Let's say he shechted the animal, and there may be other malachas hafshata. And yet Bar Kapara is of the opinion that he's only chayav for zoros, and he's not chayav for chil Shabbos. And the Gemara explains the logic of Bar Kapara in the following way. The Gemara says that Shabbos lakol nesra uksha hutra b'migdash hutra legamri gam lezarim. So again, we're on Daf Lamed Beis, Amid Beis, and we're approximately how many lines down is it from the top? Let's say 20 lines down from the top. And the Gemara says that Ein Kan Ela Zaros, that in the context of Bar Kapara Shita, when a zar does the avoda of the korban in the mikdash on Shabbos, he's not chayav for Shabbos. He's only chayav for zoros. And why is it? Because hutra b'mikdash. That's the key concept here called hutra b'mikdash. So we're up to Bal Mumche Shimesh Betuma, just that we have our finger on the place. We had Itmar Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos, and now we're up to Bal Mum Sheshimesh Betuma, which is, if you see Tosfos Dimaskal V'Su, you drop down around 5 lines, you'll see the word Sheshimesh is the beginning of the line. So before we do this, we want to take a look at the Yalkut Bi'urim. I'm just going to announce the page in the Yalkut Bi'urim at Kuf Nun Gimel. So give me a minute just to, at Kuf Nun Gimel. So first of all, in the second paragraph on this page, he's bothered by the following question. It says in Rabbi Chia that he's chayav shtayim, which means literally that he has to bring 2 chatos. Then that doesn't make any sense because a chiyuv chatos is generated by a chiyuv kares b'mezid. B'mezid you bring your chayav kares, and b'shogeg you bring a chatos. That's not true for zaros. If a non-Kohen does the avodah in the Mikdash, he violates a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, but it's not a chiyuv kares. And therefore, Rashi reinterprets the Gemara, and instead of saying chayav shtayim, meaning 2 chatos, it means he violates 2 isurim. The Ramban says that when it says chayav shtayim, it means he's chayav 2 sets of malchus, meaning if he had a hasra for Shabbos and a hasra for Zorus, then he gets 2 sets of malchus. However, the Ramban admits that there's a difficulty here because we have something called a lav hanitan lazharas mises bezdin, something we learned a couple of years ago in that room over there when we were learning the Masechet Makos, that if the lav could generate misa, then you don't get malchus for such a lav, even if you had asra for such a lav. However, the Ramban says that Rabbi Chia is of the opinion that lav hanitin lasharas misas bezdin chayav malchus. The Meiri is willing to take the Gemara a little bit liberally and say when it says chayav shtayim, it means litzdadim. In other words, if he violated b'mezid, then he'll be chayav malchus for zarus, and if he violated the shogeg, he's chayav achatos for Shabbos, for violating the Shabbos. And now we get to the Ritva's Kash. Rabbi Chia ubar kapara nechleku b'din isur chalal isur b'isur kolel. Again, there are two cases in which we might accept the principle that Isur is Halal Isur as an exception to the rule of Ein Isur Halal Isur. What are the two exceptional cases? One is called an Isur Kolel, and the other is called Bevas Achas. If two Isurim emerge simultaneously, there was not one and then the other subsequently, then Bevas Achas, Isur Halal Isur. That's going to be an issue that divides Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara in a sugya later on, which we hope to get to. However, from the language of Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara, as we read it here in our daf, you get the impression that they're only arguing about Shabbos, and soon we'll see about the case of Tumah, whether we say that since it's Hutra L'Kol, or is it only Hutra L'Kohanim, or for a Tam, not a Balmum, etc., etc. So how do we reconcile the language of our sugya, which indicates that the machlokas here is all about Shabbos, whether he's chayav for Shabbos, with the fact that the Gemara identifies this machlokas as a machlokas that revolves around Isur Chalal Isur. Says the Ritva, the MS Ikar Svaras Machlokosam Shenechleku B'din Isur Chalal Isur. The Gemara is going to later on establish that the machlokas is regarding Isur Chalal Isur. Bekan lo amru ikar hatam ela shekol echad omar ma sheyesh lo l'sayeh li'atzmo l'ma she'omar b'shem Rebbe. So according to the Tva, what we're looking at here is not the real McCoy. It's not the ikar hatam. It's just kind of like each one is bringing a support, because if you recall, each one said it in the name of Rebbe. Right? Kofatz Rabbi Chia v'nishba avoda kach shamati mi Rebbe. That was Rabbi Chia, and Bar Kapara Nishba Kofatz Bar Kapar v'Nishba Vodakach Shamati Mipi Rebbe. So they're all quoting Rebbe, but that's not really fundamentally what they're arguing about. Now, the Kasha, the Ritva, in a slightly different form, appears, or shall I say reappears, much later on historically in the writings of the Chazon Ish. And he says, Kasha, kevan shetaimu shel bar kaparu mishum she'ein isur chalal isur, it came adua omar tam zev lomar ikar atam. Why did he come up with this explanation that Shabbos is Hutra Eitzel Kohanim. The Od Kosher Yishnaf Gemina Ben Atamim Bekarban Yachid Shelo Hutra Bo Shabbos V'Tuma Afla Kohanim Tmim. What are you going to say about a carbon yachid? The Torah was never matir bringing a carbon yachid on Shabbos. The carbon yachid yischayv shtayim. Even Bar Kapara would have to admit that in the case of a carbon yachid, if the zar brings a carbon yachid on Shabbos, he's going to be chayv shtayim. If we're going to say that both Shabbos and Zoros are considered two Isurim, and one Isur is Chal and not the other, and let's assume the Isur Zoros is Chal at time T1, and only later on when we get to Shabbos, the Isur Shabbos is Chal at time T2, so time T2 is not Chal at time T1 because of the principle of Ein Isur Chal Isur, and that's going to apply equally to a carbon Sibur and a carbon Yachid. Says the Chazon Ish, Shemavur lekamon shenechelku be'isur b'vas achas. If you have two isurim that emerge simultaneously, ha'im yischayev shtayim. In other words, are both isurim chal if they emerge simultaneously? Das bar kapara lo chalim shnei ha'isurim. Why? Kevan she'isur Shabbos v'tuma hutru b'migdash v'konim tmimin. Nimsa she'isur Shabbos ba mikoch isur zoros. Wow, this is really profound lump to see. Why is it that according to Bar Kapara, he's only chayav achas? And the answer is because ein isur chal isur, even if both isurim emerge simultaneously. And the answer is because one isur causes the other isur. The isur Shabbos is a result of the isur Zoros, and I'll prove it to you, because had he not been a zar, there would be no isur on Shabbos. So therefore, as a result of the fact that he is a zar, the Torah prescribes or prohibits him from doing the malach, and he violates the Shabbos. So the violation of the Shabbos is the result of the fact that he's a zar and he's not allowed to do the avodah. In such a case, ein isur chal isur, even if it's bevasach, so that when Bar Kapara, which we'll see later on, explains that the reason he's not chayiv shtayim is because ein isur chal isur. But the question is, what about vasachas? Well, what do you mean ein isur chal isur? Isur number 2 cannot be chal on top of isur number 1. But if both numbers 1 and 2 emerge simultaneously, there's no logic, no rhyme or reason to say ein isur chal isur. On that, our Gemara gives the following explanation: that Bar Kapara holds that you're not chayav for Shabbos because it's not that Shabbos is an independent isur, totally disconnected from Zoros. No, the isur Shabbos is generated by the isur Zoros. Had he not been a zar, he would be allowed to do this shechita, etc. on Shabbos. So what generates the isur Shabbos? It's the isur Zoros. And in such a case, according to Bar Kapara, ein isur chal isur afilu b'vasachas. Even if both isurim emerge, when they blow the shofar on Erev Shabbos to tell us, that would be Makabel Shabbos. So at that point, there's an isur Shabbos and isur Zoros. Even if you call that b'vasachas, but nevertheless, ein isur chal isur, because the isur Zoros is the source and the cause for the isur Shabbos. Very lumdisha pshat. Kevan she'isur Shabbos hutra b'migdash b'kohanim Nimtza Shisa Shabbos Ba Mikoach Isa Zorus. And we're going to see something similar in the case of Tumah. We didn't read the Gemara about Tumah, so I'm just going to make myself a little bit of a line here, a siman, that we're in the middle of this Chazon Ish. And B'li Neder will come right back. Gemara says the following: Bal Mumsha Shimesh. So now we're talking about another case of an overlap of two Isurim. Has nothing to do with Shabbos in this case. But has to do with the Isur of a Kohen who's a Bal Mum, who's enjoined from doing the Avodah and B'tumah. He's also Tomei, which is what's called Tumas Haguf. A Baal Mum who does the Avodah violates the Isur and Vayikra Chafal. V'el HaMizbeach lo yigash ki mumba. And if the Kohen is Tomei and he does the Avodah, he violates Vayikra Chav Beis. The Nazru Mikadshe B'nei Yisrael, and therefore he's Chayav Shtayim. Now again, what does Chayav Shtayim mean? Rashi's going to say that Chayav Shtayim means that he violates two Isurim. Okay, then there's a discussion here about Lekovra Ben Rishonim. Okay, that was the Gemara that we touched on yesterday. Bar Kapara Omer Einu Chayv Ala Achas. Which violation is he chayav for? Only Baal Mum. Kovetz Rab Chiva Nishma Avoda Kach Shemati Mi Rebbe Shtayim. Kovetz Bar Kapara Nishma Avoda Kach Shemati Rebbe Achas. Rabbi Chia Ladun. Now Rabbi Chia is going to explain his logic. Tumah, in other words, the avodah in the Migdash, in a case of Tumas Haguf, is prohibited. Lakol Nesr. It makes no difference whether he's a tam or he's a Baal Mum. In both cases, since he contracted Tumas Haguf, he is enjoined from doing the avodah. Kishahutra b'migdash, which means that there are tumah. So again, let's start again. Tumah lakol nesra. Are you going to tell me that there are situations in which a Kohen is allowed to do the avodah b'tumah? Kishahutra b'migdash. Eitzel Kohanim Tmimim Hutra, L'Kohanim Tmimim Hutra, V'lo L'Bali Mumim. Therefore, Yeshkan Mishum Bali Mumim, Yeshkan Mishum Tumah. So Rabbi Chia emphasizes that we have an overlap here of two independent Isurim. We have the Isur of Avodas Migdash B'Tumas Haguf, and that Isur is irrelevant to the status of the Kohen as either a Baal Mum or a Tam. It's irrelevant. And if the Torah permits a Kohen to do the Avodah in the Migdash B'Tumah, like for example, in the case of Avodas HaTzibur, the Torah says B'Moado, Afilu B'Tumah, that heter of Tumah is only for a Kohen Tamid. And now he's a Balmum, and he does the Avodah B'Tumah. So what are you going to tell me, that there is a possibility of doing the Avodah B'Tumah when it's a carbon tzibur? The answer is that's only for a Kohen Tamid, but he's a Kohen Balmum. So he doesn't have the pleasure and the luxury of benefiting from the heta that the Torah was matir Tumah in the case of Avodas HaTzibur, because the Torah was only matir that for the sake, or in the case of a Kohen Tamid. But he's a Kohen Balmum, so he doesn't have that heta of doing the Avodah B'Tumah if he's a Balmum. And on the other hand, the Torah has a separate lab for a Kohen who's a Balmum who does the Avodah. And that was Vela Mizbech Lo Yigash, Himumbo. So we have here two separate Isur. And the words of Rabbi Chia will become clearer as we read now the words of Bar Kapara. Hitzkel Bar Kapara Lod, Tuma Lakol Nesra. Any Kohen, whether he's a Tamim, whether he's a Tam or a Balmum, he's not allowed to do the Avodah B'Tumah. Kishahutra B'Migdash, when a Tameh just 1 second. Tumah Lakol Nesra. The Kohen is Tameh, it doesn't matter whether he's a Balmum or he's a Tameh. He's enjoined from doing the Avodah when he's Tameh. We said that we could be matir in the case of Avodas HaTzibur, the Avodah of a Kohen who's Tameh. Is therefore Ein Kan Ela Mishum Balmum. In other words, Bar Kapara is unwilling to concede that he violates the Isa Tumah. Just 1 second. Did I get that right? Right. So as far as Tumah is concerned, he doesn't violate that Isur because Hutra B'Migdash. Again, it was only Hutra B'Migdash if he's a ta. But nevertheless, the logic of Bar Kapar is that Hutra L'Gam. Once we have that heter of Tameh, then it's like it's Hutra L'Gam. However, as far as Balmum is concerned, there was no heter. I don't know what he means here when he says below mishum avoda shehutra legam. So enkan el mishum balmum, below mishum avoda shehutra legam. What those words mean? I think he meant to say below mishum tuma, but he said below mishum avoda. So again, let's just summarize. We have so far 2 out of 3 scenarios. We'll get to scenario number 3, in which we have machlokas between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapar. Scenario number 1 is when you have an overlap of Zarus and Shabbos. Rabbi Chia is Mechayiv Shtayim, and Bar Kapar says you're only Chayiv Mishum Zarus because the Torah was matir avoda on Shabbos. And that's called Hutra L'Gam. Again, he's a Zar. Scenario number 2, a Balmum who's Tameh and does the Avod. Rabbi Chia says he's Chayiv Shtayim. We said it before, there are 2 different Lavim. One is El HaMizbeach Lo Yigash Ki Mumbo, and the other is V'Nazru Mikodshe B'nei Yisrael. And that second Lav addresses the Satuma. He's violated, in effect, 2 independent Isurim, and he's Chayiv Shtayim for both of them. That's the Shita Rabbi Chia. And once again, Bar Kapara says no. He's only Chayiv for one, namely for Balmum. Why is he only Chayiv for Balmum and not for Tumah? Says Bar Kapara, because Tumah lakol nesra uksha hutra b'migdash hutra. Just like we said in the case of Avodah b'Shabbos, kishutra b'migdash is hutra legamre. So too with regard to Tumah, we're going to apply the same reason. Hutra, Tumah b'migdash is hutra legamre. So I think the word kishahutra is going on the word tumah. Right? It says tumah lakol nesra, kishahutra. Right? And we're talking about tumah, and it's hutra b'migdash b'avodas tzibur, it's hutra legam. So he's going to be chayiv for balmum, but not because of tumah. Again, I don't know why he writes below mishum avoda. He should say below mishum avoda b'tumah. I can't explain it. Okay, now we're up to the scenario number 3. Machlokas number 3. Zar sha'ochal malika. So we have a halacha of chatas ha'of, and chatas ha'of, instead of shchita, requires malika. Now, what happens to a chatas ha'of after malika? It's eaten by the Kohen. And here, it was a zar who ate the basar chatas ha'of shenimlaka. So he violates now 2 lavin. Now let's understand why the zar violates 2 lavin. You see, there was no shchita on this oath. There was only malika. So as far as the zar is concerned, this oath is nevela. So he's violating the isa nevela if he eats it. And on top of that, he's a zar. It's almost as if we're saying here, Rabbi Chia Omer Chayiv Shtayim, because there are 2 different mechayvim. There's migdash and gvulin. You know, in gvulin there's an iser nevela, and he's a zar. He doesn't have the right or the heter of malika. He needs shchita. He doesn't have shchita. It's nevela. So he writes here, Hein mishum iser bezar lo yochal ki kodesh hein. So there's a separate iser bachilas zar, and he's a zar. Ve'hein mishum iser nevela shenemar lo soklu kol nevela. And lager asher b'tzurecha titnen. Bar mlikas haofi min ha'oref ilu shchitas haofi min hatzaver l'chem mlikas haofi nevela el shehut shel hakohanim. All right, here there's some brisket Torah here in the footnote about why it's not chai mishum treifa. It's an animal after malika is a treifa. Okay, fine. Now let's try to understand Bar Kapara. Bar Kapara, Omer ein chayv ela achas. He's a zar. Chafetz Reb Chiva Nishma V'Olo King Shavati Mi Rebbe Shtan Chafetz Reb Chiva Nishma V'Olo Kach Shavati Mi Rebbe Ach Siska Rebbe Chia Lod Nevela La Kol Nesra Shahutra B'Migdash Eitzel Kohanim Hutra. In the case of Chatas Ha'of, that was subject to Malika, not to Shchita. The Torah says that the Kohanim are allowed to eat from the Chatas Ha'of after Malika, but La Kohanim Hutra V'Lo L'Zarim. Therefore, Yeshkan Mishum Zorus, Yeshkan Mishum Malika. So it's an Isa for a Zar to eat from the Basar Kochim, Lo Sochlu Kol Nevela. I'm sorry, the Zar Lo Yochal Ki Kodeshem. And he violates the Nevela of Lo Sochlu Kol Nevela because the only heter on the Isa Nevela was given to Kohanim and not to Zarim. So Reb Chia points out, which is very logical, that the heter of Malika as a substitute or replacement for Shechita is only relevant to Kohanim. It's not relevant to Zarim. So we go back to the Isa, the original Isa Nevela. And not only that, he's a Zar who eats from Basar Kochim, that only a Kohen is allowed to eat from, and the Torah says, V'zar lo yochal ki kodeshim. Hischil bar kapar lo de nevela la kol nesach shehutar b'migdash hutra legamrei. Therefore, ein kan ela mishum zarus. So again, as far as Nevela is concerned, the Torah removed the Isa Nevela in the case of Chatas Ha'of by telling you that Malika is sufficient. Ella, what? Malika is not sufficient to be mati the Basa B'Achila for a Zar. That's already Isa Zaros. And again, if I go back to the Ritva and the Chazon Ish, now we can finish it up. V'chein Isa Tuma ba mikoch Isa Balmum. In the second case, and in the third case, the Iser Nevela comes from Zarus. The Lohutra Isurim Elu V'Kohanim Tmimim. Or, okay, he's talking about the previous case. Again, the lumdus here of Bar Kapara, which we had so much trouble with. I mean, it's like an amazing paradox, Bar Kapara, that you're only chayav achas, is that Bar Kapara always analyzes which Iser caused the other Iser. And you can judge that by the heter. If the Torah was matir it, then it means it's an ol and not an elah, if you know what I mean. It's caused rather than caused. It's on the receiving end. So let's go through the three cases. So the first case, Bar Kapara's logic is that Shabbos per se would be mutter in avodas korban tzibur. He happens to be a zar. So the Isa is generated by the Zaros. And I'll prove it to you, says Bar Kapara. Had he not been a Zar, had he been a Kohen, there would be no Isa Shabbos. So the Isa Shabbos is a result of Zaros, and therefore he's Chayav Mishum Zaros, but not Mishum Shabbos. Case number two, we have a Balmum who was Mishamish Betuma, And once again, we have a heter tumah in the case of a korban tzibur. So tumah per se is not asur. It's only asur because he is a balmum. And the Torah is only matter the avoda of, let's say, korban tzibur, b'tumah, because he's a tamim. He's not a balmum. So the reason why his avoda b'tumah is asur, the gorem ha'isur, the elah, as I called it, is the fact that he's a balmum. And therefore, he's b'chayav for doing the avoda al mizbeach lo yigash ki mum bo. And in the third case, zar sha'achal malika, there's no isur nevela here except for the fact that he's a zar. And since the Torah says zar lo yochal ki kodesh hem, according to Bar Kapara, he will be chayav for zaros. And we're beginning to see a picture, at least in front of our minds, because otherwise Bar Kapara makes no sense. To be matir Shabbos, because Shabbos would be mutter for a Kohen, that doesn't make sense in the case of a Zar. So what happened to Shabbos? Where did it evaporate? But the answer is that according to Bar Kapara, you would normally say that two Isurim that Achal b'Masachas both will be valid, and he's V'Gechayev Shtayim, unless one Isur causes the other Isur. And if one Isur causes the other Isur, then the first Isur that causes the second one is going to be a Chiyuv and not the second one, which is a result of the first. And in each case of these three cases, Bar Kapara is going to look for a heter in one of these two Isurim, and the Ma'akiv that prevents that heter from going into action is the other Isur. So that first Isur now is the cause of the second Isur. You chayv only for the first and not for the second. And now the Gemara says, "B'mai komifu," and now we're getting into the sugya of ein Isur chalal Isur. That's on Daf Lamed Gimel. The Isur kolel, v'aliba de Rabbi Yosef. Okay, let's just backtrack for a minute. The Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, and the Gemara on the top of Lamed Beis Amud Beis says Hai Isur Kolelhu. How many lines down is that from the top? About 4 lines down. No? Where is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. Hai Isur Kolel. So what was the case of Isur Kolel? It was a case where Ruvain married Rachel, and then Shimon married Leah. Do we add an Isur Achos Ishto to Rachel when she was already Asura Midin Eshes Ach? And the answer is that that's an Isur Kolel situation. Why? What does the Isur of Eshes, what does the Isur of Achos Ishto add? That now Shimon is enjoined from any one of the sisters of Leah, right? Once Shimon marries Leah, he cannot marry any of these sisters. So as far as Eshes Ach is concerned, when Reuven marries Rachel, that is an Isur that's limited to Rachel. And that means that Shimon, who marries Leah, cannot marry Rachel because she's Achos Ishto. But that has no impact, as far as the original Isur of Eshes Ach, has no impact on Rivka, we'll call her. But as a result, right, Rivka was a third sister. But as a result of Shimon's marriage to Leah, he cannot marry Rivka. So that's called an Isur Kolel. Kolel means that the Isur includes more people than the original first Isur. And now the issue is, what does Rabbi Yossi hold about an Isur Kolel? The Gemara here on Daf Lamed Beis was insisted that Rabbi Yossi only says Isur Mosif, but not Isur Kolel. And Isur Mosif means, as we said, that after Shimon married Leah, Reuven married Rachel, and as a result, Rachel becomes Asura on all the brothers. That's Eishes Achim. That's an Isur Mosif. But what does Rabbi Yossi hold in the case of Isur Kolel? Do we say Isur Chalal Isur? Or no, it's not the same as an Isur Mosif and an Isur Chalal Isur. So let's see how that applies to Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapar. The Isur Kolel v'aliba de Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Chia Savar Rabbi Yossi be Isur Kolel mechayev tarta u'Bar Kapar Savar lo mechayev el echad. So in effect, we could start backwards with Bar Kapara, because Bar Kapara really is reflecting what we said on Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, that Rabbi Yossi was only talking about an Isur Mosif and not an Isur Kolel, which means that in a case of Isur Mosif, Rabbi Yossi holds the second Isur insofar as it's Mosif that generates the Migu that we spoke about, and therefore the second Isur is Chal on top of the first Isur. But in the case of an Isur Kolel, like Achos Ishto, after Eishes Achiv, that would not be Chal. And therefore he's only Chayav Chada. So it means that if Rachel, in her relationship to Shimon, was first and foremost Eishes Achiv, because Reuven married Rachel, then when Shimon marries Leah, it does not add another Isur of Achos Ishto, because ein Isur Chal Isur. And even though it's an Isur Kolel, because now he's also in Rivka, but nevertheless, ein Isur Chal Isur according to Rabbi Yossi. The only exception is an Isur Mosif and not an Isur Kolel. That's according to who? That's according to Bar Kapar. Eino Chayv Alach. Now we go back to Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia is going to tell us that Isur Chalal Isur, according to Rabbi Yossi, not only in the case of an Isur Mosif, but even in the case of an Isur Kolel. Do we have that? Let me go over that one more time to make sure we got it right. Because, sometimes I leave out a word and it changes the whole time. According to Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yossi holds that Isur Chal al Isur, that's the Migu that we spoke about, not only in an Isur Mosif, but even in an Isur Kolel. Okay, and then the Gemara is going to try to apply it to all the three scenarios that were subject to this debate between Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapar. But what's the case of the Isur Kolel? Hainu, I'm reading the Masechet. He says in the Isur Hasheni Chala al Chatichos Acheros. Chatichos Acheros. Not Isur Mosif, which we said generates a brand new category of erva, but rather extending the Chatichos. The Isur to Chatichos. The Isha Shehi Eishes Achiv. V'gam Achos Ishto is Chayav Tarta. Rabbi Yossi would say, according to Rabbi Chia, that you Chayav 2 Chatos. Even though Reuven married Leah first. I'm sorry, Reuven married Rachel first, we said. And then Shimon married Leah. But the marriage of Shimon to Leah is called an Isur Kolel, which means that the second Isur is Chal al Chatichos Acheros. right? That's Rivka, the other sister. Ube'Iser kolel mechayev, meaning Rabbi Yossi is mechayev shtayim tarti. Rabbi Chia shechiyim shtayim. B'shlosha ufanim amurim li'el b'shitas Rabbi Yossi omar kei shechayev shtayim be'Iser kolel. So again, all the three scenarios in which, or regarding which Rabbi Chia says Yechayev Shtayim, they're all cases of an Iser Kol. Umay Iser Kol Ika Hacha. So we go through the three cases. Gemara says, let's start with Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbos. He did the avoda on Shabbos. Bishlam, I understand that very well. Meikara, before Shabbos, Shari b'malacha. Right, the Zara himself is allowed to do any malacha that would be Asur al Shabbos, but it's before Shabbos. That's called Meikara. Before Shabbos on Chol, Shari b'malacha. But he Asur b'avoda b'mikdash. But he's not allowed to do any malacha, I should say any avoda in the mikdash because he's a zar. And now we can apply the principle of Iser Mosif. Asile Shabbos is migo de kabitzar. This zar becomes also b'malacha as a result of what of Shabbos? Mitzar nami ba'avoda. I don't get it. What does he mean, mitzar nami ba'avoda? He's a zar. Let's see. He writes here, Zeu Iser Kola. Why? Kevan shenesra olav osa malacha michutz l'migdash b'Iser Shabbos. Alav Iser Shabbos v'asiyas malacha b'avodas hamigdash. This is called an Iser Kola. Am I right? Right, the Gemara is answering the question, my Iser Kola. So you can't disagree with me about this point because it's explicit in the Gemara. We're offering a definition of an Iser Kola. And that's what Rabbi Chia is going to apply here. And therefore, Iser Chalisa, because it's an Iser Kola, and that's this Migu business. Migu dekab mitzar b'malacha, mitzar nami ba'avoda. I just don't get the logic of it. What do you mean mitzar nami ba'avoda? He's asur ba'avoda because he's a zar. What does it mean? What does it mean? Migo dekab mitzar b'malacha. Do you have any note on that? On those words, migo dekab mitzar ba'avoda. I'm sorry, b'malacha.
Temple service that was previously prohibited to him as a non-Kohen now becomes further forbidden to him as a Sabbath prohibition. This is an example of an Easter Koel, more inclusive rather than an Easter Mosif, because a more extensive prohibition is when it prohibits the previously forbidden object to more people. In this case, however, the forbidden activity, the temple service.
Understand what you read? I mean, it's very fancy English.
Right. Does not become prohibited on the Sabbath to anyone new. On the contrary.
Oh, wait, no. You're a step ahead of me. You're explaining why it's not an Easter Mosif. But first, let's understand why it's an Easter Kola. And then we'll try to negate Easter Mosif.
Well, it's saying because.
Why is it an Easter Kola?
Because it's more
extensive?
No, it's more things that are prohibited to.
Well, you extend it to all 39 malachas as opposed to avoda, which is only shchita and hafshata. Is that what you mean? It's more extensive in terms of how many different malachas are prohibited. Is that what it means?
The one person.
Let's read it into the Gemara. Meikara shari b'malach. Asur b'avoda. So again, the Isur avoda was unaffected by Shabbos, right? Because that Isur avoda applies to a zar, whether it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Shabbos. However, his Isur is only an Isur avoda as a zar. Comes along Shabbos, and it generates a new Isur, which is called Malach. There's avoda and Malach. Tzvei dinim here. And that makes it an Isur Kola. Hasilei Shabbos, and now we're going to apply the migu of an Isur Kolel, like we said in Achos Ishto, that now through the marriage of Shimon to Leah, he becomes Asur to Rivka, a third sister, and once the Isur of Hs of Achos Ishto is Chal vis-a-vis Rivka, it's Chal also vis-a-vis Rachel. Here too, once the Isur of Malacha is Chal vis-a-vis Malacha, therefore it's also Chal vis-a-vis Avod. You know what I'm thinking to myself? Even if the Avoda doesn't entail a Malacha, I kept harboring on Shechita and Afshat. Forget about all that. Let's talk about Zrika Saddam or Kabbalah Saddam, maybe even Olacha Saddam. I don't know. These are avodos, which, in the case of a zar, would generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, even though there's no malach involved. So what's the chal shem isur? What's the oser? The oser is avoda. He's doing it on a carbon in the Beis Hamikdash, and he's a zar. That's an isur avoda. It's totally different than an isur malach. And therefore, if there happens to be an overlap, it's almost coincidental. But once we have that overlap, we can apply the migu. What's the migu? The migu is going to say the following, that Shabbos generates an Isur Malacha. Is migu to come mitzar b'malacha, mitzar nami ba'avoda. Just 1 second. I don't get it. Wait, so what was it mean? Mitzvah, he's also avoda even if it was chol. Mitzvah nami ba'avoda. So I'm almost there, but I mean, you guys are way ahead of me, so I'm sorry. I apologize. It takes me a little longer than you. Migu de mitzar b'malacha, mitzar nami ba'avoda. Since Shabbos comes along, and what? The Isur Avoda applied Erev Shabbos. Let's call it Friday, right? But Shabbos expands the Isur Avoda to the Isur Malacha. Just 1 second. And it generates a brand new Isur Malacha, which is going to entail all 39 Malachas. Because therefore, it could also be Chal on the Isur Avoda. So since the Isur Avoda, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Is he talking about an Avoda of a Malacha? Let's assume he's talking, I'm keeping going back and forth. I hope I'm not driving you crazy with the ping pong ball going both sides. Let's talk about the Avoda of a Zar on Shabbos when that Avoda coincides with Malacha. Okay? So now you're asking me, could the Shabbos Isur add anything? And the answer is yes. And I'll prove it to you because that Isur Shabbos applies to all 39 malachas. So when he's doing an avodah, just one second. I keep getting confused about this one point. Take a look again in your footnote. Are we talking about an avodah that entails a malach of Shabbos? I think so. Right? That makes sense, no? Keva the mikara shari v'malach, but aser b'avoda.
It don't make sense.
Right? It's got to be an avodah that's malacha. No, that he should spell that out over there. Unfortunately, There are no notes here. Whenever I need the notes, they're not there. Anyway, I'm a big fan of Masechet. But okay, so Meikara Shari B'Malacha. Let's say, for example, a Zar on a Monday or on a Friday, right? He's allowed to cut his nails, right? What he's not allowed to do is an avoda in the mikdash because he's a Zar. Asilei Shabbos, so that's as far as Friday is concerned. Now it's Shabbos. And now he's not allowed to cut his nails. Right? That's one of the 39 malachos. It's malachas gozes. Is migu the kamitzar b'malacha. So Shabbos is now going to expand the application of the Isur to include all malachos because of Chil Shabbos. Is mitzar nami b'avoda. So the Isur Avoda now takes on a whole new complexion, a whole new element, the dimension of Melecha Shabbos. So the Avoda now is upgraded to Malach, and that adds a whole new Isur. And that's called an Isur Kolel. What makes it Kolel? Because now all Malachas are prohibited. Had it been Friday, only avoda would be prohibited. Now all malachas are prohibited. And according to Rabbi Chia's understanding of Rabbi Yossi, I can apply migu and I can say that since the second Isur, namely Shabbos, adds and expands from avoda to malacha, which is a jump from like 1 to 39, therefore, it generates a whole new Isur as far as Avodah is concerned. And that's the logic of Isur Chalal Isur be Isur Kolel. Now, what we want to try to analyze now is why is it called an Isur Kolel and not an Isur Moses? That's where I stopped you in the middle there. Let me just see here. He says, the Ein Zeh Isur Moses. This is not considered an Isur Moses. I want to underline these words. The Ein Zeh Isur Moses. She Isur Mosif hu rak the ofen sheba'osa pu'ula nosaf Isur shenesra al acherim. So again, the emphasis here is the word acherim, I think. Do you follow me? Like, for example, we said in Eshes Ach, now she becomes Asura al Kol Ach, right? That's acherim, which we used to define it as a brand new Isur. I don't know if a new Erva Isur, I don't know if that's what he's doing over here. So now Shabbos doesn't really expand the Isur Zarus to Acherim. I mean, all Zarim are prohibited or enjoined from Avodah and Mikdash, and all Balei Tmimim, all Tmimim are Mutavim. I mean, Shabbos doesn't affect the expansion of the Isur Avodah. The Isur Avodah remains fixed in its place. Maybe that's what he's saying. He says, Agav, this is the case of Isur Mosif, Shenesra al Acherim, is Neseres Gam Olav, the Isur Nosaf, Aval Kan, Shar HaKohanim, Shahayu Mutarim B'Avodah Zu, Lo nesra aleim avoda zu gam b'Shabbos. Right, so what are we saying? That any avoda in the Mikdash, in the case of Korban Tzibur at least, is mutter on Shabbos. So Shabbos doesn't have the ability to add an Isser avoda to the other Kohen. Because all the Kohanim are allowed to do the avoda on Shabbos. So again, the expansion is because of Malacha. Malacha is opposed to avoda. That's called an Isser Koleh. That's called an Isser Koleh. But it's not to be classified as an Isser Mosif. Why? Because Mosif means Mosif La'cherim, Aval Kan, Shara Kohanim, so you turn Avodah Zu, Nesra Aleim, Avodah Zu Gam B'Shabbos. So the Isser remains in Isser Zah. Just 1 second, is that what we're talking about now? In Isser Zah. So the Kohanim are impervious to the Isser Shabbos. In other words, if you want to add a dimension to the Isser Avoda and say it's an Isser Shabbos, that's true for a Zah. But that's not true for a Kohen. So Shabbos doesn't expand the Isurim to the Kohen. They remain in the strict domain of the Zarm and not beyond. Nesru Aleim Avodah Zu b'Shabbos. So Avodah Tzibur Hutra b'Shabbos b'Mikdash. You see, the reason why we have to make sure that we reject Isser Mosif is because if you would come up with Isser Mosif, then you would have no room for explaining Bar Kapara. Now we have to leave room for Bar Kapara. So we're going to have to say that according to Reb Chia, we can add the second Isser of Shabbos and you'll be Chayv Shnayim because of the principle of Isser Kola. And Rabbi Chia is going to equate Isser Kola with Isser Mosif, but Bar Kapara is going to argue that there's a fundamental difference between an Isser Kola and Isser Mosif, meaning that this case of a Zar Sha'avad B'Shabbos, right? Avad b'Mikdash B'Shabbos, that's a case of an Isser Kolel, it's not an Isser Mosif. So we have vested interest here, we have an obligation to clarify why this is not an Isser Mosif, because if it were an Isser Mosif, then for sure Rabbi Yossi would say that Isser Chalal Isser, because that's the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. If you started with the marriage of Shimon to Leah, and then subsequently Reuven marries, what's her name? Rachel, that's called an Isser Mosif. Correct? That's an Isser Mosif because now, as a result of Reuven's marriage to Rachel, Rachel becomes Asur for all the Achim, to all the Achim. Acherim, that's the word Acherim over here. And that makes it into an Isser Mosif. And that's why Rabbi Yossi holds Chayv Shtayim. So how could Bar Kapara say here, in the case of a Zasha Avad B'Shabbos, he's only Chayiv Achas? The answer is because this is not an Isser Mosif. It's only an Isser Kolel. It's Kolel because I think, if I understand correctly, it expands the Avodah to all Malachos. But it's not an Isser Mosif because, as far as Shabbos is concerned, if you have a bona fide Kohen, he has his two-dot kahuna on his wall, then there's no Isser of Melecha Shabbos, because the Torah is matir avod on Shabbos. Narvas, Shabbos adds as far as the Zar is concerned, and that's called an Isser Kolel and not an Isser Mos. Okay, so that's what we have for today. Whoa. I don't know, gentlemen, you may find this easy. I don't find this easy. I find this very challenging. All right, what's tomorrow? Tomorrow's Wednesday? That happened? I don't know. Okay, so we're here on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. What line are we up to? We're up to Balmum, which is about, about 7, 8 lines down from the top? Yes? Where is it?
7.
Okay, 7 lines from the top. Now I just have to put something here. I'll be able to find it. Put this thing here. Put this on the side, and we'll learn a little bit of Mida now. I wish everyone a great day. Thank you.